Good morning. I am Macy Forsyth. I'm the Director of Children's Faith Development here at UUFM. I am serving as Worship Associate this morning alongside our minister, Reverend Diana McLean, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Mankato. All of you, whether joining us in person or on Zoom, are welcome in this time that we make sacred together. We extend an especially warm welcome to you if this is your first time attending one of our worship services. We appreciate that it can be difficult to cross the threshold of a new church for the first time, whether in person or online. This morning's service is multi-generational. There is childcare available downstairs, but no children's chapel. As always, children are welcome in worship and not expected to be perfectly silent and still, but if you as a parent would prefer, you're welcome to at any point take them to the wiggle room or downstairs to the nursery, from which you can still see or hear worship from the wiggle room. Please do what works best for you as a family and know that all ages are not only welcome but celebrated here. Sunday morning is a team effort, and we are grateful for all those who make it happen. If you are attending by Zoom today, you are welcome to stay after the service to visit together. For those attending in person, we have refreshments in the fellowship hall after worship. We acknowledge that our fellowship meets on the traditional homelands of the Dakota peoples. In continuing to understand our shared history, accepting responsibility for reparations, and building relationships in the here and now, we want to go beyond land acknowledgement as we seek to be good relatives. We have just a few brief announcements this morning. Today is the last day to donate items for the Giving Tree. Thank you to all those who have brought in donations this holiday season. This Wednesday, January 8th, from 6:30 to 8, I will be guiding the first in a series of discussions for a social justice book club. The title of the first book we're exploring is called Let This Radicalize You, written by Miriam Kaba and Kelly Hayes. Whether or not you've read the book yet, I'd love to welcome you there, as I anticipate we will take a few sessions to cover this material. This Saturday, January 11th, I will also host an intergenerational hike at Rasmussen Woods at 10 a.m. if anyone would like to go hike together. And next Sunday, a week from today, January 12th, is our mid-year congregational meeting. It will begin at 11:30, immediately following worship, both in person and on Zoom. And after the meeting, there will be a luncheon downstairs. So that covers all our announcements for today. Together, let us kindle a flame symbolizing our co-creation of sacred space at home and in this place made sacred by years of love. If you are with us on Zoom, please write in the chat that a chalice is lit on your street. And please say the words with me from the pew cards or the slide. We are welcoming people of diverse beliefs who commit to nourish the spirit, broaden the mind, nurture the earth, and build community. May this flame we kindle remind us to strive today and every day to love beyond belief.
Our call to worship this morning is Weavers of One Story by Leah Ongiri. Here we are, together, each facing our different human tasks, or maybe the same central one, to embrace the lessons life delivers, to discern and respond as we grow, to refuse harm and cherish flourishing. May we know ourselves as vessels of infinite possibility, holders of each other's heartaches and tales of joy alike, weavers of one story in which we each have our part. Come, let us worship together. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join in singing our opening hymn, number 361, Enter, Rejoice, and Come In.
So today's worship, Reverend Diana and I are reflecting on some classic children's tales. So I selected one of my favorite children's books from when I was little to read today. And it'll actually, the original will come first, and then a version that I found online of the story that was rewritten, or the ending was rewritten, that'll come second. So some of you might be familiar with this book. It is called The Rainbow Fish. I should mention too, if any of the kiddos want to come up, I do have some worksheets on healthy boundaries. So if that's something anyone's interested in grabbing from me, I can either bring them to you if you want to raise your hand, or you can come on up. So.
Have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 pairs full. One for my master and one for my dame. One for the little boy that lives in the lane. Baba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 pairs full. One for my master and one for my dame. One for the little boy that lives in the lane. Baba, black sheep, have you any wool? Yes, sir, 3 bags full. Yes, sir, 3 bags full. what he could see. To see what he could see. The bear went over the mountain. The bear went over the mountain. The bear went over the mountain to see what he could see. To see what he could see. To see what he could see. And Bingo was his name, oh, B-I-B-I-N-G-O, B-I-B-I-N-G-O, B-I-B-I-N-G-O. And Bingo was his name, oh. And Bingo was his name, oh, B-I-B-I-N-G-O, B-I-B-I-N-G-O, B-I-B-I-N-G-O. And Bingo was his name, oh, B-I-B-I-N-G-O, B-I-B-I-N-G-O, B-I-B-I-N-G-O. And Bingo was his woof, woof, name, oh.
Generosity is one of the spiritual qualities we aspire to and one of the practices we nurture in this community. With our offering, we give of our resources to support the work of this church. We know that giving financially is only one of the ways we support that work. We do it too with our time and our talents. All three are necessary for the vital work we do for each other and for the wider community. I'll also mention that each month we take up a second collection every Sunday to support one of our community partners organizations who are in alignment with our values. This month's second collection will go to Partners for Housing, which guides individuals and families on a path toward housing stability. Next month is their Pedal Past Poverty event, which will be held at the Mankato YMCA on February 22nd. For both the regular and the second collections, you can give in person as baskets are brought around, or online using either the QR code on your Zoom screen or on the Pew card, or the giving link on our UUFM homepage. If you are here in person but give online, as many of you do, we invite you to touch the basket as it passes you, in a small ritual of recognition of your financial commitment to the congregation. Please give as generously as you are able. I share a little reflection. I have come to realize that much of the growth and learning I've done as an adult has required just as much shedding and unlearning the messages that no longer ring true to me. Many of the messages that I find out of alignment are the ones that were present in the literature and films that I enjoyed in my childhood. One example that we read today was what I would consider a favorite childhood book, The Rainbow Fish. Ironically, as a young child, I always remember being drawn to the book not because of the story itself, but due to the aesthetic beauty of the shimmering scales and the illustrations. Still, I now view this and many other stories through a more critical lens. Whether or not children are really internalizing the messages presented is sometimes hard to know, but they often grant us the opportunity for a teachable moment. One might infuse their own take on the story, as well as offer prompts for children in our lives to practice voicing their own thoughts and questions. Both The Rainbow Fish and another very popular book, Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, have drawn significant criticism because of the way they blur the line between encouraging generosity and exhibiting incredibly poor boundaries. If anyone here is not familiar with the latter, the Giving Tree is a character that companions a boy from his early to elder years. For much of their relationship, there was a sense of play and reciprocity, as the boy created leaf crowns, climbed the tree, napped in her shade, and ate her apples, until eventually he cut the tree down to just be a stump. Somehow, said stump still believes that the boy is a dear friend, which I and many others do find questionable. An internet meme that reads as an alternative ending to that story states in response to the boy wishing to chop her down, the tree said, "No, it's time we set some boundaries," and the tree was happy. Based on how much I have personally witnessed friends and family members overgiving to the point of depletion, I find questioning the narratives that we are sharing with the younger generation of utmost importance, in hopes to nurture a more sustainable and balanced foundation in those who are just beginning to learn how they might relate to one another in caring and healing ways. And we all must discern and sense for ourselves whether we are metaphorically pouring ourselves out or lighting one another up. There are ways of giving that don't require us to drop parts of ourselves. One more problematic line that I recalled in the planning of this service is from a childhood movie I frequently watched, Disney's 1942 film Bambi, in which a rabbit named Thumper states, "If you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all." I remember my early caregivers echoing this sentiment and have reflected on it often, as it was a message I really internalized. I found that it was that kind of subconscious, anxious patterning that prevented me from courageously speaking truthfully in moments when I feared I might be perceived as rude, mean, or disruptive. However, I've come a long way since then, and now when I notice a moment of discomfort or anxiety arise in myself, I most often challenge myself to be brave. The line that lives in my heart instead now comes from Brené Brown. Kind is clear, nice is unclear, therefore it's unkind. So now as I grow my integrity and clarify my values, I am less concerned with how polite I appear when I know in my heart that I am remaining as kind and loving as possible while speaking my truth. As a closing invitation from me, I'd love to hear from folks attending today, perhaps during coffee hour, if you too recall specific messages from the media you viewed as a child that you eventually dropped as you grew and changed. So that concludes my reflection, and now we'll hear a little bit more beautiful piano playing from Justin before Reverend Diana speaks.
Before I go into what I wrote, I just want to say that it was only in conversation with Macy preparing for this service that I realized that Bambi movie is where, if you don't have something nice to say, don't say anything at all, came from. It was so ingrained in my family culture that I just thought it was what everybody was told. So thanks to Macy for bringing that to my awareness. When I was 4 or 5 years old, my godmother gave me the book Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder for my parents to read to me, and it became one of the first books that I read. From that point on, my godmother sent me the next book in the series, one each birthday and Christmas, until I had the whole set. They were among my favorite books, and I kept them for decades. I think I might have been almost 50 before I got rid of them. But as I got older, I began to notice things that I hadn't picked up on as a child, especially how the books talked about Indigenous people in a way that was, to put it mildly, unkind. Negative stereotypes about Indigenous people were, of course, not uncommon in Laura Ingalls Wilder's generation, and even later. But as I became older and learned a more honest history of white settlers' interactions with Indigenous people, I stopped enjoying the Little House books, and I eventually did get rid of them, along with other books that I felt no longer fit my values. Recently, I discovered a podcast called Wilder about Laura Ingalls Wilder, her daughter, Rose Wilder Lane, who was also a writer, and the Little House books that I grew up with. I'm not going to share much about the podcast now to avoid any spoilers, and I do recommend it for anyone else who loved the books and is interested in learning more of the factual history behind them. One detail I will share that caught me a little off guard until I thought about it a bit is that the Little House books, if you go to get them out of a library, they are actually classified as fiction, though as a child, I thought they were autobiographies and therefore 100% truthful stories. There's a long story about that in the podcast to do with marketing and what appeals to an audience. So they are based on true stories. I haven't finished the podcast yet, but I am appreciating the chance to revisit those favorite childhood books with an adult lens. And I may even get the books from the library to reread them with my new knowledge after I finish the podcast. I think I'd like a chance to enjoy again the parts that I loved, like putting hot maple syrup on fresh snow to make homemade candy, while having more context for the attitudes that I now find offensive. The older I get, the more stories from my childhood and teenage years disappoint me when I revisit them. Not just stories like the Little House series with racism that was unfortunately fairly normal in that era, but also most of the movies I loved as a teen, especially the John Hughes ones. If you're of Gen X like me, those may be familiar with you. Movies like Breakfast Club and 16 Candles, most of which I now recognize have some really problematic storylines, often about relationships between teenage boys and teenage girls. Never mind the fact that in that era we were not talking at all about non-binary folks or trans folks. Even more recently, my love for all things Harry Potter was seriously marred by the hateful anti-trans rhetoric of the author, J.K. Rowling, who is not only not at all apologetic for the pain she has caused, but actually continues to double down on her positions. I just saw another hateful tweet from her within the last week or two. I can no longer enjoy those books, movies, and games because of what I now know about the author. That opens a much larger conversation about, do we separate the art from the artist? But that's a topic for a different day. I am happy to report that not all of the beloved stories from my childhood or earlier adulthood have turned out to be so disappointing, though. One set of movies and also books for those of us who are diehard fans that I continue to love is the original Star Wars trilogy, episodes 4 through 6, for those of you not familiar with the timeline of how the movies came out versus where they fell in the storyline. Episodes 4 through 6 came out during my childhood. In fact, I'm pretty sure that the first one, Star Wars A New Hope, Episode 4, was my first non-animated film in a theater when it came out in 1977, and I was 6. A point of pride for 6-year-old me was that my 3-year-old brother didn't get to go because my parents determined that Darth Vader was too scary for a 3-year-old. I think he was probably too scary for a 6-year-old, but they let me go anyway. Those 3 original Star Wars movies, and many but not all of the ones that have come out since then, still hold up to my values. I have, in fact, written seminary papers and preached whole sermons on Star Wars and the messages that it has for us today. And you can count on me doing that here on May 4th, as I do every time that May 4th, which is known to Star Wars fans as, say it with me, May the 4th be with you. Every time that falls on a Sunday, my congregation gets treated to a Star Wars sermon. For today, I will just say that the morals and theology of Star Wars have been important for me since I was 6, and that in all seriousness, I actually consider Yoda one of my earliest spiritual teachers. My family is also a Star Trek appreciating family, for those who pit those two against each other. And while the special effects in the early decades of Star Trek look pretty funny from our modern perspective, the diversity of characters and the lessons taught mostly still hold up to our modern expectations. For the adults among us, whatever your favorite stories from childhood are, my guess is that some of them remain appealing to you today, and others feel outdated and perhaps downright disappointing when you revisit them. This is not to say that they were bad stories or bad authors. I don't believe that Laura Ingalls Wilder set out to be racist about Indigenous people. She reflected the attitudes of her time, especially of her childhood. That's true of many stories and many authors. It's true of us as humans. And it's part of what can make those childhood stories charming or disturbing, depending on the topic and probably on the reader. I know that some people are able to just glide past the parts that now feel problematic. I will admit that I struggle more to do that. And when my son was little, if we read an old book with an outdated attitude, like the first time I tried to read him a Hardy Boys book and realized that it too reflected a culture that was not current, every time that would happen, I would interrupt the story and we would have a discussion about whatever topic it had raised. I suppose that's one of the hazards of having a UU minister for a mother. Maya Angelou, who is one of my favorite writers, has been quoted as saying something to the effect of, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." The same idea applies to our stories. As we individually and collectively know better about topics like racism, sexism, ableism, and how to fully respect people of all genders and sexual orientations, we can do better. Writers can write more inclusive stories. Readers can choose stories that align with our values and share them with others. And when we encounter stories with troublesome messages, we can have honest discussions about them with children and with other adults. We can even seek out or maybe even write alternative endings to some of those stories. For Sunday services, Macy and I normally choose stories that we don't find problematic, stories in which there is nothing we feel we have to have those kinds of discussions about, nothing that would cause us to interrupt the story, have a little lesson moment, and then move on. We know, though, that not all lessons that we learn at any age come from stories we fully agree with. We both learned about boundaries from The Giving Tree. We just learned very different lessons depending on when we read it and what our own boundary health was at the time. The key is in how we handle the parts that we disagree with, and especially parts that go against our deeply held values. This is true for so much of life. We are offered many messages, and we get to evaluate them through the lens of our own values and our own experiences, and decide which ones to treasure, which to put aside, and sometimes which ones to revise. May we all continue to find stories that nourish us, stories that challenge us, and stories that we can tell each other to help make sense of our world. Amen, and blessed be. I invite you to rise in body or spirit and join in singing hymn number 123, Spirit of Life.
As Reverend Diana extinguishes the sanctuary chalice, please extinguish your chalice at home and say the words with me. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
As we prepare to leave our time of shared worship, may we remember the power of story and choose wisely which stories we read and tell. And may we weave a beautiful story together. May that be our practice and our prayer. I now invite you to rise in body or spirit and turn toward each other for our singing benediction, blessing each other with these words, knowing that we are each a blessing to each other.